managed to curb the pandemic really well, we are somehow concerned about a sudden surge in cases in Vietnam over the past few days. To my knowledge, yesterday and today, we have not recorded any cases here in Hanoi. However, over the past few days, we have registered roughly 200, 300 cases nationwide, primarily here in the north. Now, for those of you that are listening to me from Europe, probably 200, 300 cases in 5 days is a laughable amount. Here, the situation is taken really seriously. So thanks to the serious approach to the pandemic, thanks to the cooperation between the people and the government, numbers are kept down. The other major thing that I would like to mention in this context is that Vietnam has entered two very important free trade agreements recently. One is the European Union Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, the acronym being EVFTA, which also includes an agreement on investment protection, which is the EVIPA. And more recently, I have not written it here, my fault, which is the RCEP. You know that ASEAN, so the 11 countries that are members of ASEAN plus China, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, and maybe I'm forgetting somebody, have joined probably the largest free trade agreement in the world, whose effects will be deployed in the next probably 15 years or something like that. But we see that this region that has tackled the pandemic quite well has taken action in order to create this free trade area, despite the regional differences and even geopolitical tensions among some of the participants in this free trade agreement. So this is the context. The context is that this part of the world, and Vietnam in particular, is doing really well. That due to the pandemic, Western companies, and not only Western companies, realize that they cannot put all their eggs in one basket, read China. Hence, Vietnam is really picking up. Vietnam was already doing very well prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic was an accelerator of many things, including the fact that Vietnam has become a major manufacturing hub in various industries. Now, investments have suffered. International investments into Vietnam have seen a decline in 2020 due to the fact that foreign investors cannot really travel to this part of the world. There are severe limitations in order to contain the spread of the virus. So trade is the main trend. However, in 2020, after 10 years or 6 years, depending on which law you're considering, whether the law on investments or the law on enterprises, Vietnam, the legislature decided to make some amendments to the two laws that regulate investments in Vietnam. Now, while it is still difficult to travel to Vietnam, it is nonetheless indeed possible to invest in the country. And I have firmly believed through all these years that I have been active in this country since 2007, that investing here is a damn good idea. So allow me to show why I think that this is a good idea. A direct investment in Vietnam, a direct presence in Vietnam, could make a lot of business sense. If it does make business sense, and this is up to the investors and to the managers to decide, it allows a company and its products to have visibility on the market, to be competitive, to promote its products. This is particularly true. There are a few Italians that are following this webinar, and I know very well how we Italians are proud of the quality and the image of our products, but at times we need to promote them according to the local communication styles, and we need to create a culture, if you want, surrounding a certain product, which is not necessarily sold on its own, as we say in Italian, non si vende da solo. So promoting products in Vietnam is certainly easier if you have a direct presence here, and indeed legal protections. I mean, this is probably the worst case scenario, but if you enter into lawsuits locally, you can indeed defend yourselves. You can also go for arbitration. Vietnam has pretty good international arbitration centers. You can enforce international awards, arbitral awards in Vietnam. Vietnam is a member of the New York Convention on the recognition of international and enforcement of international arbitral awards, you can protect your intellectual property rights more effectively, also through usage and not just through registration. Sometimes it is indeed required to have a local presence in order to register certain IPRs. I'm not an IPR specialist, but it is something which is indeed fascinating. And thanks to the EU-Vietnam Investment Protection Agreement, you also have a protection against nationalizations and expropriation. So these are some of the reasons why, on top of business and economic reasons, it makes a lot of sense to have a direct presence here. Now, I see that there are several Vietnamese following the webinar. Before we go into the details, allow me to wish you all a good day, a blessed day of the God of the Kitchen. I know it is an important day in Vietnam's tradition. We have just celebrated with my fiancée here, so I forgot to say this at the beginning of my speech. Now, if we were in a live audience, the very first thing that I would do now would be to ask you to raise your hands, but of course we cannot do it now. And I would ask you if any of you already has a direct presence in Vietnam. Some of you may already have a business, or you may be employed in a company that is legally registered here in Vietnam. Maybe you have a representative office or a branch office, etc. So allow me to give you some background information, because some of you may already be experts in all things Vietnamese. Some others have never even been to this country, perhaps. Some others may have some patchwork information. So allow me to give you some essential information about your direct presence in Vietnam. First and foremost, there are two laws. The title of this webinar is Amendments to the Law on Investments and the Law on Enterprises. So yes, you guessed it right. There are two main laws that regulate enterprises and investments in Vietnam. Of course, they're not the only ones. You have the law on securities, you have banking regulations, you have specific regulations that regulate different types of businesses. You have the civil code. For those of you who are not familiar with the legal structure of Vietnam, Vietnam is a so-called civil law country. So in Vietnam, we have a civil code that more or less derives from the Code Napoleon that we are quite familiar with in continental Europe, including Italy, of course. There are various ways to establish a presence in Vietnam. You can establish a representative office. I'm a big fan of representative offices, for instance. A representative office is a very lean and simple and cost-effective way to set up a presence in the country. However, it does have a lot of limitations. Representative office cannot issue invoices, for instance. It is not practical if you really want to do business in this country. It represents, by definition, a mother company located elsewhere. You may want to establish a branch office, which I'm not a fan of. A branch office essentially works pretty much like a company. It can invoice customers and it has to pay taxes in Vietnam. However, it is not legally separated from the mother company, which is a bit of a contradiction in a way, and a limitation in my personal view. So the best way to establish a presence here, unless you want to go for a representative office, is to set up a limited liability company or a joint stock company. Both companies, of course, bear limited liability. If you want to set up a unipersonal company, so with one member, as the jargon, as the English Vietnamese legal jargon is, calls it, you can only opt for an LLC. If you want to have, for whatever reason, a joint stock company, a JSC, then you have to have at least 3 members or shareholders. When I say the word member, I may be referring to, I am actually referring to shareholders in the English jargon. Mind you, the word member can also be used in English to define members of the council, basically the board of directors, or the governing structure, the governing organism that manages the company. There is a bit of a mismatch in translations and the usage of certain words in Vietnam. Now let's go to the fourth point. With the exception of regulated industries, there is no statutory minimum share capital. Here we call it charter capital. Again, there is a slight difference in jargon, but it's not a big deal, which is already something that puts off a few investors. In my experience in these 13 years of activity in and with Vietnam, I have never seen a foreign invested enterprise with a charter capital that was below at least 50, 100,000 US dollars equivalent in Vietnam dong. Naturally, you can use that money, but this is something that, especially in this region, with the predominance of Hong Kong and Singapore as regional headquarters, sometimes discourages investors. That is, in Singapore and in Hong Kong, as you know, you can set up a company, a limited liability company, with the exception, of course, of regulated industries, with $1 share capital. In Vietnam, you need to have a higher amount of money as charter capital. You need to pay it in full within 90 days. We'll see that in a moment. Then there are 2 certificates that you need to get, possibly 3. And I'll mention the third one in a moment. First, you need to apply for an investment registration certificate under the law on investments, and then an enterprise registration certificate under the law on enterprises. The third certificate would be a trading license in case you wish to trade in Vietnam. So if you want to open a shop, this is something that has been deregulated recently, a couple of years ago, if I'm not mistaken. If you want to operate a retail shop, you need to have a trading license. So you can do it, but you need to have an additional license. We're not talking about trading licenses in this webinar, but it is important to know that these 2 certificates may not be necessary for you to operate in this country if you wish to conduct certain types of businesses. Now, first, we have 2 laws, 2 main laws, the law on investments and the law on enterprises, for practical and historical reasons. They stem from Doi Moi, 1986. Those of you that are not familiar with the history of Vietnam should know that in 1986, Vietnam embraced Doi Moi, which means renovation, and essentially embraced a free market economy which is oriented towards socialism. Hence, Vietnam needed badly pieces of legislation that would regulate business, including the law on investments and the law on enterprises. They have been amended a few times. And as I mentioned, the last time that they were amended was in 2020. And they are now in force since the 1st of January 2021. So they're really fresh. And indeed, may I anticipate something that will come up later for sure with the questions. There are some loopholes and there are some gray areas which are not necessarily clear enough, not even to specialists or even to the legislator. However, they have been amended. The whole idea behind the amendments to the 2 laws, and here is where I'm getting a bit more technical and perhaps a bit boring for those of you that are not into these technical details, is that there is a higher stress on national defense and security and on the competency of local investment authorities. Essentially, Vietnam has a Ministry of Planning and Investments, a Prime Minister, and local authorities. Each province of Vietnam, or each major city like Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, etc., has a local department of investments and planning. And depending on the size and on the type of investment, you need to apply to that department or directly to the minister or even to the Prime Minister, if it is a particularly significant investment, both in terms of size and in terms of industry. With these new laws, actually with the amendments to these 2 laws, especially through the law on enterprises, there is more powers are delegated to local authorities. However, authorities have more power in intervening where something goes wrong in the company. I will tell you more about it in the law on enterprises. Let me go through these few details. and then we can talk about each individual point if you want. First of all, this is nothing new, but there are in Vietnam 227 conditioned industries. What are conditioned industries? Conditioned industries are those industries where foreign investors, as well as local investors, there is now a so-called negative list. That is, they're put on the same level. Foreign investors and local investors in certain instances are put on the same level in that they cannot do certain things. They have to meet certain requirements in order to invest in specific industries. Good news, 12 industries that were in the past conditioned under the old law are now unconditioned. These includes, for instance, two very important industries are logistics services and franchising. So if you wish to set up a franchising network in Vietnam, this is not a conditioned industry anymore. For instance, the same applies to logistics, the same applies to certain research and development activities, to some clinical activities and so on. I have the whole list if you want to see it. When it comes to those conditions, the government has more flexibility and discretion, either in granting more attractive market entries to foreign investors or in revoking them. This is the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law is that the government can step in more quickly. In the past, procedures, and this should be seen as a positive sign, mind you. I may feel, even though I'm not personally with you, I may feel that some of you could frown and say, well, wait a second, is the government going to intervene in my business? Yes, but in a better way than before. Before, you needed to go through infinite procedures. Now procedures are simpler. So if a business is stuck, the government can step in. And the government is allowed to step in even through simpler pieces of legislation, such as decrees and circulars. Whilst in the past, amendments to the law or new laws had to be enacted in order to change the sandbox. There is now a list of industries, again, there's a whole list, that offer equal access to foreigners and Vietnamese. So in this case, this is very good news for foreigners. Foreigners and Vietnamese are at the same level when it comes to certain industries with regard to market access. However, this is not so much of a good news, but it has its rationale behind. Foreign investment enterprises, sorry, I didn't write it in full. FIE means foreign investment enterprise. A company, an enterprise, is deemed to be foreign invested when the ownership of foreigners is equal to 50% or more of the shares. This has an impact on joint ventures with Vietnamese entities. What I'm trying to say here is that if you have a company which is 100% yours, this is no big deal. It is a foreign investment enterprise, that's it. But if you form a joint venture company with one or more Vietnamese shareholders, be it natural persons or companies in Vietnam, in the past, this joint venture was not considered to be a foreign investment enterprise if it had less than 51% of the shares allocated to the foreign shareholder or member, as they say here in Vietnam. Now it is 50%. The reason being that clearly, especially in larger entities, you may have a more scattered shareholder structure, and 51% is not necessarily the majority of votes. It could be 50% plus one, hence the 50% threshold. This is quite important. Again, authorities can step in to terminate investments in case of sham transactions. What are sham transactions according to the Civil Code? It is those transactions where basically foreigners utilize local companies to act on their behalf. Mind you, there is a fine distinction between a mandate or a fiduciary obligation. Note, Vietnam is not a common law jurisdiction, so the institution of trust is not as used, or it is very limited. Its usage is not as widespread as in common law jurisdictions such as Malta, Singapore, and many other countries, England, of course. But basically, there is a fine line, as I was saying, between giving powers to a local entity to conduct a certain business, and utilizing a local entity to do something that you're not allowed to do if you're a foreigner. So if there is a sham transaction, this is actually good, especially, let me try and rephrase it in a polite way. But basically, if you have some unwanted foreigners that are using complacent Vietnamese to do something that the law does not allow them to do, this can be terminated instantly by the authorities, which is very good news again. The same applies to the payment of the share capital, the charter capital. There is a deadline of 90 days for the payment of the charter capital. If you don't do it, then the investment is terminated. There are, however, linear procedures for approval. There are incentives, especially for small and medium enterprises and companies that operate in IT, digital medicine, research and development, high tech, new energies, renewable energies, clean energies, etc. When I mention incentives, don't be fooled by the word incentive. It means that there is a tax break. If you're looking for funds, there could be funds given by international organizations, by foreign governments, foreign aids, etc. But the Vietnamese government limits these incentives to tax breaks, which is good, because taxation in Vietnam is not exactly high, but it is not even as low as in other ASEAN countries or in Hong Kong. So it is good to receive these tax incentives if you invest in certain new industries, or if you're an SME in particular fields. Good news, M&A approvals. Well, first, in the past, you needed, and even now, you needed to communicate to authorities. You need to notify authorities in case of an M&A, of a merger and acquisition procedure. In certain cases, I will show you a table. Actually, I will show it to you now. These procedures have been eliminated. So let me show you. Let me zoom in. If the target company, so you want to acquire a company, you want to merge with a target company. If this company is not subject to market entry conditions, so in the majority of cases, then there is no approval for the M&A, for the merger, or for the acquisition, when the aggregate ownership of foreign investors and deemed foreign investors after the acquisition is less than 50%, or transfer among foreign investors or deemed foreign investors. This is something that was not the case in the past, so you need to have essentially approval for M&A transactions. It is simplified. It is not particularly simple yet, but it is simpler than it was in the past. The last 2 points I have already mentioned. So no stress on national defense and procedures and competency of local investment authorities. Last point, and then we can focus on your questions, which I have already received, is the notable changes in the law on enterprises. The new law on enterprises states that there are equal rights and obligations for each legal representative, unless otherwise stated in the Articles of Association of the company. This is quite unclear because evidently there could be different wordings in the Articles of Association. And again, the government can step in where the Articles of Association are not particularly clear in defining such rights and obligations. And again, they can remove a legal representative if the legal representative is deemed to have difficulties in understanding or controlling his or her actions, which is a very broad, very broad definition, which is open to interpretation. So when it comes to this, unfortunately, this power vested with authorities is quite broad and not very well defined. Anyway, the third point, it's simply is just it's more of an anecdote than anything else, but essentially you don't need to report to notify authorities for the seal content. Those of you that have not done business with Asia or with Vietnam in particular, the seal of a company or even a representative office is of particular importance, not just in Vietnam, but all over this part of the world. Essentially, when you sign a legal document, you should also stamp it with a company seal, which is given to you by the authorities upon incorporation of the company itself. The seal has to contain at least the name of the company and the code of the company itself. In the past, it had to contain more pieces of information, which made it a bit complicated. Now, the seal is simpler in its aesthetics. Still, even though this has been simplified, because the seal is one, and you should use it also for tax purposes and banking regulations, you have to follow the stricter regulations, which are precisely the tax and banking ones. As mentioned earlier, capital contribution, you have to pay in the charter capital within 90 days. However, these 90 days do not account for administrative and other procedures for ownership transfer. This applies particularly to contributions in kind. So if capital contribution is made through anything which is different than money, be it rights, real estate, machinery, you name it, intellectual property rights, you name it, the time that is needed for the transfer of such non-monetary capital contribution is not calculated within the 90 days. So again, it could be a bit troublesome and it could cause some headaches, but it's good news. There are a few rules about pre-incorporation contracts. In the past, pre-incorporation contracts would automatically bind a company. Now it is not the case anymore. So if any of you sign an agreement before a company is incorporated, and you, in your mind, that contract is going to bind the company, for instance, for the acquisition of machinery, for the pursuit of certain business goals, etc. If it is not transferred, this is a civil law principle that was not applied in the past. If it is not expressly transferred, assigned to the company, then it is not valid for the company. It is still binding for the parties that have signed the contract itself, of course. There are a few changes, but these are really detailed points. I'm not sure whether these are of extreme interest for all of you, but basically minutes of meetings are valid if they're signed by all members of the company, even if they're not signed by the chairperson. In the past, this has to do with the past. So if you had a company before here in Vietnam, maybe you were used to the fact that minutes of meetings were signed by the chairperson of the company and the secretary of the meeting, and it was not necessary to have them signed by all the members. Now it is the other way around. They have to be signed by all the members, but if they're not signed by the chairperson, they're still valid. So this is good news because it takes power off the chairperson and it curbs the risk of forging corporate documents. Major news, point number 7, non-voting shares allow for majority ownerships. What does that mean? That for certain types of investments, I mentioned the list earlier in the law on investments, you had, and you still have, limitations on foreign ownership of certain businesses in certain industries. The new law allows for the issuance of ordinary shares which do not include voting rights. If that is the case, then a foreign investor can indeed have more than 49% of the shares in such company. This is a very good news for Vietnam's businesses because it allows for local companies to gather capital injections from abroad without breaking the law. So essentially you have a company which is managed by Vietnamese, whose decisions are taken by the Vietnamese, but whose capital contributions are given by large, say, investment funds and other investors that deem that that business makes a lot of sense. Other major news, limited liability companies can now issue bonds. In the past, if you wanted to issue bonds, you needed to have a joint stock company in place. Now it is LLCs that can do that on top of JSCs. Again, the procedures are quite complicated. I'm not going to go into the details, but it is worth mentioning that this is now a possibility. Members Council, I mentioned that before. there's a bit of confusion on the word, on the English word members. That is a limited liability company's members council, which is the governing body, the administrative body of the company, includes all the individual members of the limited liability company and the authorized representatives of the individual members in the LLC. So essentially, if a member of the company, a shareholder, let's use the more widespread terminology, if a shareholder appoints somebody else who is not a shareholder as his or her authorized representative within the council, then both parties are represented in the council. This is quite important. Interestingly enough, in the past, you need to have an inspection committee. In most cases, it is not needed anymore in LLCs. In JSCs, yes, you still need it, but the role of the inspection committee has been reduced. There are linear procedures for the changes of managers. There are, let me jump to point 12. There are clear definitions on liabilities of managers and shareholders in that they hold fiduciary duties towards shareholders themselves, other managers, and more importantly, third parties. And these duties have been better defined, including what happens in case of breach of such duties. There has been an increase in the percentage of votes for the approval of related party transactions. And there has been a decrease in the percentage given to minority shareholders to achieve certain goals. For instance, to access corporate documents that are not covered by trade secrets, to call for general meetings, and so on and so forth. In the past, minority shareholders' rights were possible only for a minority of at least 10% of shareholders. Now it is 5%. So these are the notable changes in the two laws. The spirit, as I said, goes towards more power for the authorities in correcting mistakes. So where you have a company which is mismanaged, where you have sham transactions, the government can step in. And that's good news because the company doesn't keep on existing, making mistakes and creating damages for itself and third parties and the state. And the second main goal is to simplify certain procedures. Now, I perfectly understand that this long list of changes doesn't look like things have been simplified, but trust me, over these few years, actually many years of expertise and exposure here to Vietnam, I can tell you the procedures are indeed complicated. And even if there have been simplifications in a number of procedures, ultimately, it is always a case-by-case environment. There is no one-size-fits-all rule. The law is general and abstract, as we lawyers say all the time. But when it comes to its implementation to individual cases, we really need to study the precise case. I leave you with my contact details at the end here. At the end of this slide, I'm more than happy to share that with you. Let me stop sharing the screen and allow for questions and answers. I see that there are already a few messages in the chat. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Federico, for showing us about the all the changes and about the, well, I will not say the new law, but or the new regulation of the Vietnamese local authority that bring attention to the foreign business community to do business here in Vietnam. So right now we will switch into the Q&A part, and I would like to ask if any of us want to have a question for the first question to Federico about this specific theme of the webinar by today, or even if any related question about what you have been showing us by far. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Actually, allow me to, hi, I have received a direct message from Ambrogio. I am sure that he's okay if I read his question out loud to everyone.
Yes, please.
Ambrogio asks if there are any restrictions when it comes to repatriation of charter capital, dividends, interest, and royalties. Yes and no, in that the spirit of the law is that there are no evident restrictions as long as you have paid taxes in Vietnam. However, banking regulations do impose certain restrictions on the repatriation of capital, dividends, interest, etc. Also because the Vietnam dong is not freely tradable outside of Vietnam. So you need to exchange Vietnam dong at the company's bank in euros in your case, or whatever other currency, and then transfer with all the supporting documents that money outside of Vietnam. So in theory, there are no tight limitations. In practice, yes, you need to be prepared to have all the supporting documents in place. I'll give you a personal example. When I was still working in Italy, and I had a branch office of my then law firm here, we had a Vietnamese client that had to pay for our services. So we issued invoices, and they faced a lot of difficulties with their bank in paying us, not because they were looking for excuses, but because they truly had some difficulties in making the payments in euros outside of Vietnam. What they needed, the bank, to tell you how complicated this could be, the bank asked for the invoices. The invoices had to be stamped, even though in Italy we don't really use stamps that much, but in Vietnam they do. So in order for the bank to approve the Italian invoice, they wanted to see an invoice that was stamped by us, by a law firm in Italy. They wanted to see the letter of engagement between our law firm and the client. Again, the letter of engagement had to be signed and sealed by both parties. And finally, because they were recurring invoices, so every month we would issue an invoice for a certain amount of money, they wanted to receive a report on the activities that we had conducted, which is clearly in breach of confidentiality between lawyers and clients. But had we not given those pieces of information to the bank would have denied the authorization to the payment. The client was okay with that, so we did it. So the answer is yes, you can do it. Be prepared to do in Rome, do in Rome as Romans do, and do in Vietnam as the Vietnamese do. That's essentially the rule.
Yes, Federico, we have the second question in the chat section from Joseph. What are the conditional business activity removed in the new law on investment?
Let me take the list because, of course, I don't know them by heart, but I have them here. So the 12 conditioned industries that are not conditioned anymore are commercial arbitration services. So if you feel like setting up an arbitration center in Vietnam, go for it. Franchising, as I mentioned, logistic services businesses, ship agency service, real estate brokerage training and retraining services, HIV testing services. You know that HIV is indeed a problem in certain areas of Vietnam, so this is quite important. It is also, it's good for the population. It is an interesting business. Reproductive support services, sperm banks, storing of embryos, testing for microorganisms causing infectious diseases. Clearly, this is aimed at defeating the coronavirus, as well as bacteria and other viruses that could plague the country, especially in remote and deprived areas. Vaccination services, opioid addiction treatments with substitution drugs, cosmetic surgery services. Cosmetic is one of those industries that are really surging in Vietnam. That should be it. That should be it. So I hope I answered your question, Joseph.
Yes, and the next question, please. Is anyone in the?
I received an email which has more to do with it's a direct message that I have received from Yuri that asks, can the legal representative or managing director of a two-member LLC be denied a work permit? I know that to receive a work permit, you should prove to the Molisa that a local hire is not able to meet business requirements. Yes, if I understand the question correctly, the answer is yes. You could be denied a work permit. So I assume that you're talking about a foreigner, of course. And again, we are not focusing on the core matter of the of this webinar, but I'm more than happy to answer this question. The answer is yes, because we're talking about immigration laws. So the fact that you have a director who's a foreigner in the company does not necessarily grant the director the right to work in Vietnam. Also because a limited liability company, as well as a representative office, needs to have a legal representative in Vietnam who is a resident of Vietnam. But the others, so if you have a board of directors, you could have members of the board who are not residents in Vietnam. And this is good news for foreigners. If you invest from abroad in Vietnam, you can have a legal representative who resides in Vietnam, and the others can reside all over the world. So yes, you need to meet the requirements in order to have the work permit.
Great. The next question, please.
Hot question, but important. How the government is fighting the corruption that exists at any level? Well, it is fighting corruption. I would say, okay, let me be very open to you. I sense that the 12th Congress of the Communist Party that was held in 2016 marked a major important step towards the fighting of local corruption. And this has been confirmed with the 13th Congress that finished a few days ago on the 31st of January. Why? Because of a higher concentration of powers at a central level. How does that result in business? Well, the immediate consequence is that Hanoi has become the city with the highest amount of foreign direct investments in Vietnam. It's not Saigon anymore. Whilst Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, has the largest number of Western expats in Vietnam. If you come to Hanoi, where I'm talking to you from, you will see entire areas of the town that have been built by the Japanese and more notably by the Koreans. And indeed, Hanoi is doing really well in attracting foreign investments. You may remember that Hanoi was supposed to host the Formula One Grand Prix in April 2020. So there is a trend towards the centralization of things in politics and government management, which of course gives more power to central authorities to clamp on corruption at the local level. And the spirit of the two amended laws goes in that direction, because, as I said, the government can step in, which is good. I'm thinking in particular about sham transactions, where you have foreigners that bribe locals to perform certain things that they would not be allowed to do. Then the government finds out and intervenes, and this is good. So my feeling is positive. Which are the typical steps? Vincenzo's asking, what are the typical steps that a foreign company has to follow for setting up a franchising business in Vietnam, a company or what else? Well, the typical steps are to set up a company here. Limited liability company is sufficient if you have a single member. You set it up according to the framework that I shared with you before. So essentially, you need to have an investment registration certificate and an enterprise registration certificate, after which you will be allowed to enter into franchising agreements with local entities. Evidently, if the other franchisees are foreigners, they will need to go through the same process. And that's essentially it. So you have to set up one or more companies according to the rules, and then have the proper agreements in place amongst the members of the network. If you ask me what the typical steps that I suggest are, as you know, I have a vested interest here, but I'm going to say it anyway. I have the headquarters of my firm are in Singapore, and the Vietnamese like Singapore very much, and the Westerners like Singapore very much as well. So perhaps in certain cases where the structure justifies that, it could make sense that, say, in your case, you're Italian, the Italian company sets up regional headquarters in Singapore. In the past, it was mostly Hong Kong, but now it's mostly Singapore. The Singaporean company sets up the company in Vietnam, and then it does whatever it has to do here in Vietnam. Why would I use Singapore as an intermediary company? Because it's easy. Because it's easier to deal between Vietnam and Singapore that are both members of ASEAN. So you have a free trade area with zero or very low import and export duties, with similar cultures in a way. There's a very large Vietnamese community in Singapore. There are important investments, massive investment from Singapore into Vietnam. And Singapore is somehow the neutral jurisdiction for the whole area. So if you want to go to court in Singapore, certainly Singapore has a pretty strong tradition in judicial and arbitral matters, and it is a place which is generally accepted by sophisticated businesses in Vietnam. It is more difficult to convince a Vietnamese counterparty to go to court in Milan or in Naples or elsewhere in Europe than to convince them to go for arbitration or even a normal lawsuit in Singapore. So, and on top of that, of course, consider all the simplicities that you have in Singapore. I mean, Singapore ranks first or second every year in the Heritage Foundation list of countries where it's for ease of doing business. You have a very attractive tax system and so on. It is an English-speaking country and so on and so forth. So it makes a lot of sense. If you have a decently large business, it makes sense to have regional headquarters in Singapore, especially to protect yourself, but also to protect the Vietnamese.
Yes, Federico, I have two questions that's quite relatable. The first one is, what for the foreign company or Italian company, for example, what is the minimum structure to set up a company here in order to open a bank account in Vietnam? And the second question, account. Yes. Mm-hmm. And the second question is, if I'm not mistaken, Vietnam and Italy has signed avoiding double taxation back to 1994, 1995, something like that. Yep. So it means that in Vietnam, the flight test is 20% currently. And after having paid on the test in Vietnam, what is the minimum differences that we have to pay in Italy?
Okay, for the first question, it's not so difficult. I mean, opening a bank account anywhere in the world has become a big headache, as you know. Essentially, you need to go through KYC procedures and AML regulations, and Vietnam is not an exception. So as long as you pass the KYC tests and the AML tests set forth by Vietnamese banks, both local banks and foreign invested banks like HSBC and whatever other foreign bank that operates here in Vietnam, you name it, you need to provide the bank with the initial investment proposal and inject the capital in the so-called direct investment capital account, DICA, DICA, direct investment capital account. The money is frozen in that account. Then the company receives the enterprise registration certificate and it is free to operate. So the bank account is then transferred to the before it is owned by the shareholders. I forgot to say that, and then it is transferred to the company itself. But there's no minimum requirement. I mean, the requirements are set by individual banks to set up a bank account here. But as long as you abide by the law for setting up a company here, it could be a super small company. You can have a super small office, a single member company, a minimum share capital. As I said, there's no minimum share capital in Vietnam, but usually it is 50, 100,000 US dollars equivalent in Vietnam dong, if not more. This is for the authorities to approve the project, and that's it. The second question was, I forgot, sorry, hi.
Yeah.
Taxation. Yes. Sorry. Okay. So probably we should involve Ambrogio, who is an expert in this field in Italy. But essentially, there is a main difference between Italy and Vietnam. That is, in Vietnam, almost anything constitutes income. So if you have financial gains, capital gains, dividends, whatever, they form part of your income and they're taxed according to the tax rate applicable to your tax base. In Italy, like in many other countries, we have a distinction on the type of income. So it is a capital gain, it is taxed in a certain way. If it is income deriving from your job, it is taxed in a different way, and so on and so forth. So this is the major difference. That is the big headache when it comes to the application of the double taxation agreement that was signed 25 years ago or so between the two countries, is to determine what tax in Italy would apply on the amount of money that you're transferring from Vietnam. Because in Vietnam, you pay X on your tax base and that's it. But when this money comes to Italy, is it a dividend? What is the ratio? What is the justification behind the repatriation of that money to Italy? If it is a dividend, then it will be taxed as a dividend in Italy, especially at a personal level. So if you're an individual shareholder of a company in Vietnam and you receive your dividends, they form part, even if you have already paid corporate taxes in Vietnam, then once you have gone through the procedures to repatriate that money, you will be taxed in Italy on the dividend that you're making. And that dividend will be part of your taxable income in Italy and will be taxed as such, as a dividend. But if you bring money back as a loan, as a salary, as anything else, then the treatment will be different. But if you're talking about income, once the company has paid its income taxes here in Vietnam, I don't think you should pay anything in Italy except for dividends, because there is no taxable income in Italy. We're talking about two different subjects. One entity is the Vietnamese company owned by the, in this case, Italian or foreign shareholders. The Vietnamese entity pays its taxes here, and then whatever remains available for the shareholders to bring back as dividend will be taxed as dividend for each individual shareholder. It is different if you have a branch, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not a fan of a branch office in Vietnam, because a branch office is part of the same legal entity. So if you have a legal entity in Italy, a limited liability company in Italy, a società responsabilità limitata for Italian speakers, and the società responsabilità limitata has a branch in Vietnam, the branch is not a separate entity. The branch pays taxes in Vietnam on behalf of the mother company. That creates a problem, of course, in calculating the different levels of taxation in the two countries. But we would have to read the DTA between the two countries in order to address this specific question, because again, there are general rules, but what is the concrete case? We don't know. We have to see who the shareholders are, where they reside, what they do, in what industries they operate, and what is the ratio behind the repatriation of capital from Vietnam to Italy or any other country.
Thank you, Federico. We have other two questions from the first one from Perth. Which one is more common for establishing a joint stock company? First, with the HQ Vietnam branch. Second, with the HQ itself. Does both have different concern on ROI and ROE?
I don't think I understand the question. Perth, if you can unmute your microphone, I would be more than keen to listen to your question.
Oh, hi, I'm not sure if you could hear me.
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay. My question is, I'm not sure which is more common, if we would like to establish a JV, a JS company with our company itself, which is a foreign company, in international company, I'm sorry. Or second, we already have a subsidiary company in Vietnam as a LLC limited already in Vietnam. So I'm not sure if we would like to establish a second company, which is a JS company to support.
Understand.
To
Understand the question.
Other business. Yep. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for clarifying, Perth. The answer is what type of investment certificate you have, because you have your existing Vietnamese company will have already an investment certificate, an investment registration certificate, which is given by the authorities based on the investment proposals that you have made before. So if you're going to operate in a business which is related to the same industry for which you already have the investment certificate, then the new law, the amendments to the law, allow you to operate under the same investment certificate. So you don't have to establish a new entity. If, however, you want to operate in a different field, which is not covered by the investment certificate, then you need to apply for a new one. So essentially, you need to set up a new company. Then there's William. In the spirit of the new law, what industries is Vietnam in general and Hanoi in particular trying to attract? What industries are on your radar, and how about Italian companies? It's a broad question. Thank you very much. I would say anything that has to do with clean energy, renewable energies, mobility. There are. I will be more than happy to send you some notes that were given by a very large financial institution here in Vietnam that recently held a webinar on what companies to watch. And they said, this is a company that we would be keen on investing. We would suggest buying the shares of this other one. But essentially, so I'm more than happy if you can send me a direct message or through Hi. I will send you the slides via email if you allow me to. Yeah. But essentially, I would say, thank you, William. But essentially, I would say anything that has to do with clean energy, pollution, so fighting pollution, mobility, etc. More then, when it comes to smaller industries, I would say cosmetics. In Ho Chi Minh City, for sure, cosmetic surgery. You asked me about Italian companies. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Vincenzo. When it comes to Italian, and thank you for participating. When it comes to Italian companies, I'm afraid we're always there. We have a few champions. We have Piaggio, Bonfiglioli, Datalogic, Eni, and a few others that have been here in Vietnam for several years, at times even more than 10 years, but we don't really see a large number of investment flows from my home country, unfortunately. We see a lot of trade. We have seen an increase in trading in machinery, so B2B essentially, and also B2C with regard to changes and developments in tastes by the Vietnamese consumers. So it is more and more common to find Italian wines in Vietnamese restaurants, for instance. Okay. But I would say that it doesn't really have to do with Vietnam. I would say that Italians in general prefer to sell their products. And because Italian products are so good, and it is true, I'm Italian, I'm proud of our products, they say, okay, we should basically conquer all markets that are available, which is a bit narrow-minded and short-sighted in a way, because I believe that Vietnam could be an excellent manufacturing point for a chiefly manufacturing country like Italy. I just got the list, by the way, of preferential investment industries, and these include, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, high tech, new materials, new energy, electronics, agricultural machinery. This is very important. I had forgotten to mention that. Automobile parts, shipbuilding, information technology, software, digital content, waste management, waste collection, waste processing, etc. Infrastructures as usual. Preschool education. I noticed that you work in school probably. Yes, Concordia International School. So yes, preschool education, general education, vocational education, university education are amongst the preferred industries. This is the this is Article 16. If you want to take a look at that, that's basically it. But it gives you an idea of what the industries are.
We picked up a couple of new Italian families, so that's recently. So that's why I asked.
There are more and more Italians coming to Vietnam. It is, I assume you live here in Vietnam, and it is a beautiful place to live. Italians love it. So I see more and more Italians living here because they're employed by local companies. But I don't see an inflow in investments, unfortunately. I keep on repeating myself, but this would be the best place for Italian manufacturing companies to invest in. And I'm not saying as an alternative to Italy, I'm saying in addition to Italy. You keep your made in Italy, you keep your, it's like Apple designed in Cupertino and manufactured in Guangzhou. Apple, by the way, as you know, has invested through Foxconn already in Vietnam. So I believe that Italia should do something similar. Got your email, thank you.
Yes, is any other question? If there's any, please feel free to send the direct chat so we can read the question to Federico.
I think that Ms. Huyen had sent a list of questions, and there was one about where is it? Ms. Huyen had sent me a list of questions, but I cannot find it now. Ah, yes, here it is. Yes, there was one which was quite interesting, and I had to study that. The question was, I can't find it here. How to? There was a question about investing abroad from Vietnam. How to register? Would like to get updates. Investment capital. I cannot find it, unfortunately, but there was a question, I'm sure that I read it somewhere, about investing from Vietnam to other countries, which at a first sight is a simple question that, okay, well, you can invest in a different country as long as this is allowed, but reality is that the laws include a list of industries where the Vietnamese cannot invest if they do business abroad, which is quite interesting. So for instance, there are some trading of endangered species, for instance, trading of certain products. For instance, there was, but perhaps there still is, a limitation on the trading of personal protective equipment because Vietnam needs to stock up masks, gloves, etc. for its own population. So there are a number of these limitations which are interesting. Essentially, on top of the laws of local laws in the destination country that prevent anyone, including foreigners, from doing business, there are also limitations that are imposed by the Vietnamese legislation to Vietnamese nationals when it comes to doing business abroad. This was an interesting one. I don't think we have received any more questions.
Yes, so if we don't have any other question, first of all, on behalf of the organizer of the Italian Chamber of Commerce, we'd like to say a big thank to Federico Vasoli, which is again one more time to share with us his deep knowledge and wonderful consultancies to the new law of Vietnam business environment. And also we'd like to thank you to all the participants to join our webinar in such a numerous way. And Fede, could you put your contact on the screen so everyone can see it? And if any participant want to have more further detail or other question or to discuss more in detail with Federico or with us about new business in Italy or any eventually opportunity about the law or services, please feel free to contact us directly or to Federico directly. Fede, if you want to share something.
Yes, I will send you the slides so that I will actually amend that point on top where I mentioned free trade agreements. I will also add the RCEP and I will share the slides with you. So if any of you is interested in receiving the slides, please refer to ICHAM and I'm happy to share them with you. That's it. Thank you very much for listening to a pretty intense presentation about really technical and detailed pieces of information. I really look forward to holding more seminars like this in person, getting rid of Zoom finally.
Yes, and last but not least, if the situation is allowed, the next webinar that we organize, because also this webinar was supposed to organize in presence and transmit directly on the internet. But however, if the situation is allowed, the next webinar that we organize both in Hanoi or in Ho Chi Minh City will be in physical presence and transmit direct on air directly on the internet. And last but not least, if any Italian company present want to find a potential opportunity in Vietnam regarding the business, new business local partner, as the Chamber of Commerce, we are more than happy to help. And if any Vietnamese companies want to look for opportunity business in Italy, like looking for a new supplier, the technology or distribution of the product or whatever, also we are more than happy to provide services to you. And along with that, from the commercial side, the legal side will have also here that Federico or Vasoli will assist you more than a very satisfying way. So thank you everybody for joining our webinar, and we are very looking forward to meet you again in our next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very, very well delivered and interesting seminar, and I appreciate Mr. Hai for organizing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, William. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.